Hello, sleepy traveler. Welcome to Drowsing Through History, where the stories are strange, the facts are real, and you're absolutely invited to doze off before the end. Tonight, we're slipping into the silken halls of medieval courts and candlelit castles to wander through the curious and often dangerous world of the court jester. You might think of them as harmless fools in motley garb, jingling their bells and cracking jokes, but behind that painted smile often lurked sharp wit, sharp danger, and a life lived on the knife's edge of power and peril. Let's begin. Let your body relax. Let your eyes grow heavy. There's nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just listen and imagine. Before there were court jesters in velvet hats, before there were thrones and castles and banquet halls, there were fools, or at least ... beings like them. Not fools in the way we might think today, with floppy hats and painted faces, but sacred, strange figures. People on the margins, dancing along the borders of reverence and ridicule. The earliest jesters didn't call themselves that, but they existed. In ancient Egypt, under the burning sun and eternal sky. Within the echoing stone halls of the pharaohs, entertainment was not just welcomed, it was woven into the fabric of the sacred. Among the pharaoh's retinue were entertainers, acrobats and dancers, but most precious of all were the dwarfs. To the ancient Egyptians, dwarfs were more than performers. They were symbols of divine mystery. Their unique bodies were considered magical, touched by the gods. One such man, a dwarf named Deng, served during the reign of Pharaoh Nefertiti. His movements were a form of prayer, his presence a blessing. So valuable was he that records suggest the pharaoh sent expeditions far into unknown lands simply to find others like him. They were not mocked. They were exalted. Their dancing was holy. Their laughter was ritual. Now let your mind drift eastward, to ancient China, where emperors ruled behind silk screens and golden dragons curled across painted ceilings. In the imperial courts, jesters played a vital role, but not just to amuse. One such jester, Yushi, served under the infamous Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who ordered the building of the Great Wall of China and buried an army of clay soldiers. To guard him in death, Yushi was clever. Too clever perhaps, but he knew how to speak. In a court where even generals feared the emperor's wrath, Yushi danced around danger using wit and irony. When Qin proposed flooding a valley to create a vast lake, an idea that would destroy thousands of homes, no minister dared to oppose him. But she did. Not directly, not rudely. He turned the absurd into a joke. He performed a skit. He mocked the lake gently, with rhymes and riddles, and the emperor laughed. The idea was dropped. The valley was saved. Here, again, the fool became more than entertainment. He became a mirror, a whisperer of difficult truths, a subtle challenger of power. Now travel, in your mind's eye, across oceans and jungles, to the high temples and sun-drenched cities of the Aztec Empire. Here, too, the role of entertainer held meaning. Jesters in Aztec courts were often multi-talented comedians, singers, dancers, and satirists. But unlike many court entertainers in Europe, they were not lowly, they were respected. Their job was to challenge, in performance, the assumptions of the elite, to remind them that laughter, especially laughter at oneself, was a kind of wisdom dot across the sea and into pre-Columbian North America. Among the Hopi, Lakota, and other indigenous tribes, you would find another version of the fool, the sacred clown. These clowns did not juggle or crack jokes. At least not in the way we think of it. They would walk backward through ceremonies, say yes when they meant no, shout taboo truths in the middle of silence. They disrupted, but not to offend. They disrupted to reveal. Their humor had purpose. Their inversion of order forced others to reflect, to question, to pause. Among the Hopi, the clowns were known as kosher, striped in black and white, with gestures and behaviors meant to satirize greed, pride, and wastefulness. Children would giggle. Elders would nod solemnly. The clown's foolishness was a sermon. And so, across continents and centuries, the figure of the fool emerged again and again. Not always with bells and capes, but always dancing at the edge of comfort. Always whispering, always watching. These early jesters were dangerous, not because they held weapons, but because they held mirrors. They could make kings laugh or cry. They could shift public feeling. They could shame or exalt. And because of this power, they were protected, and sometimes punished. Even in ancient India, the Sanskrit plays included the Vidushaka, a comic figure who poked fun at the noble characters. In a culture built on order and rank, the fool was allowed to defy it. He spoke nonsense that made sense. He stumbled into wisdom. He reflected the audience's flaws and made them laugh. While seeing them, it's no coincidence that these characters existed nearly everywhere. Something about the human spirit seems to need them. That one figure who can laugh in the face of danger, who can say what must not be said, and live to tell the tale. As time passed and empires rose and fell, this role would take on new names and new costumes. The sacred clown, the trickster, the masked dancer, and eventually the court jester. But all of them shared the same precarious dance between truth and treason, between laughter and loss. And as we drift into the candlelit chambers of medieval Europe, where the modern jester would finally take form, we must remember this long legacy. The jester is not new. The jester is ancient, a spirit in many masks, a thread that runs quietly through history, always laughing, always watching, and always in danger. Imagine, if you will, the creak of heavy wooden doors opening to reveal the flickering glow of torchlight. The walls are stone, thick and cold, built to keep enemies out and secrets in. This is not the glittering fantasy of storybooks. This is a real medieval castle, smelling faintly of smoke and sweat, of damp stone and roasting meat. It is here, in the middle of echoing laughter and whispered plots, that the court jester steps forward. Not from noble birth, not by sword or inheritance, but by wit. The medieval court was a theatre, a stage where every noble had their part to play. Knights polished their armor and egos. Nobles performed their loyalties. Queens measured every glance, and kings sat surrounded by flattery, too much flattery, dangerous flattery. And so, the jester he entered the stage not as a prince or a warrior, but as something stranger, a truth-teller dressed in nonsense, a performer who did not bow low, but danced, twirled, and laughed his way into the highest chambers of power. But it was not easy. The life of a jester began, often, with nothing. A misfit child with a clever tongue, an orphaned girl with an eye for mimicry, a man who spoke 5 languages, but was too low-born to be anything but laughed at, so he turned it to his advantage. Sometimes they were trained, sometimes discovered, sometimes bought. Some jesters were born with physical or neurological differences, what today we might call disabilities. In a time when such people were marginalized or mistreated, a handful were brought into the court as entertainers, This is not kindness as we know it, but it was a strange kind of protection. The court took in the odd, the strange, the gifted, and gave them a role. A dangerous role. Because here's the thing. Once you were a jester, you lived in a strange in-between. You were neither noble nor servant. You were above the rules, but only until the king decided otherwise. You could mock a duke, but only if the king found it funny. You could sing of the queen's jewels or the bishop's belly, but if the room turned cold, your life might end as quickly as the laughter did. Some jesters slept on rush mats in cold corners. Others had their own rooms, warm clothes, and access to the best food. It all depended on how useful they were, how entertaining, how safe, or unsafe. The court felt around them. Imagine one now, a jester entering the grand hall during a winter feast. His clothes are motley, a patchwork of bright colors, not just for fun, but because they mark him as different, as apart. Bells jingle with every step. He wears a cap with ears like a donkey or horns like a devil, symbols of foolishness, but also of freedom. He approaches the king. The music fades. The court hushes. "Your Majesty," he says, "I dreamed last night you were wise." Laughter erupts. A clever start, a gentle jab. The king smiles, and so the jester begins. Jokes and riddles, stories and rhymes, all told, in a sing-song voice, with a twirl of the wrist or a high, silly hop. But underneath each line is a seed of commentary, about the taxes, about the war, about the bishop's new horse. He mocks everyone, but never too much. He dances on a tightrope above a pit of silence, and tonight, at least, he doesn't fall. Some courts had multiple jesters, a natural fool, often someone with an intellectual disability, and a clever fool who wrote jokes, composed satire, and played instruments. The natural fool was often protected by law. Their status meant they were not always held responsible for their words. The clever fool, though, their tongue was their sword, and they had to wield it well. Jesters were sometimes sent ahead of a royal party to entertain villagers, or behind closed doors to lighten tense negotiations. They were used to distract, to calm, to manipulate, and to observe. In a time of spies and whispers, jesters were often both spy and whisperer. But always, their job came with risk. One wrong word, one joke gone too far, one secret said too plainly, even in jest, and they could be beaten, banished, or worse. To be a jester was to be valuable. But to be valuable in a royal court was never safe. And still they came, because where else could a poor boy with clever fingers and a sharp tongue rise so high? Where else could a strange girl who saw the world sideways be given a place? In a world of rigid hierarchies, jesters lived on the edge of respect, on the edge of laughter, on the edge of a blade, and yet they smiled, not because they were fools, but because they knew something the nobles didn't. That all of this, the castles and courts, the titles and crowns, was a kind of theatre, and someone had to be the one to say it. And so, night after night, feast after feast, the jester walked into danger, armed with nothing but his wit and a fool's grin. Let your breath slow, let the image fade gently, the jester bowing low, stepping backward out of the candlelight. Tomorrow he may rise again, or fall, but for now, let him rest. Picture a quiet morning in the servants' wing of a stone castle, before the clatter of plates, before the stir of soldiers and scribes. The jester is already awake. Somewhere, far down a dim hallway, he is pulling on his motley, that peculiar patchwork of colors stitched together in loud contrast, reds and blues, yellows and greens, triangles and diamonds, all colliding in deliberate chaos. It wasn't a random look. No, motley was a statement, a signal in a world obsessed with status, where fabric, color, and cut defined who you were and what you were allowed to do. Motley broke the rules. Nobles wore deep jewel tones, crimson for the rich, violet for the divine, black for power, white for purity. But the jester wore them all at once. He wasn't claiming any one title. He was mocking them all. Motley was meant to be loud, garish, unmistakable, like a walking riddle, a warning and an invitation. When you saw a man in motley, with a cap that flopped like a donkey's ears or curved like a devil's horns, you knew exactly what you were dealing with, someone who answered to no one but the king, someone outside the chain of command, someone who might insult you with a smile and be applauded for it. But here's the twist. Motley was not just permission, it was protection. In court, colors mattered. If you wore the wrong hue to a banquet, you could offend a baron. If your trim was too fine for your station, you might be accused of pretending nobility. The jester, though, he could wear gold, velvet, silk, even bells, and no one could say a word, because motley made him invisible and unforgettable all at once. He was not competition. He was not threat. He was ... Hers hat, often a coxcomb, the jester's cap, shaped like a rooster's crest, was no accident either. Roosters were symbols of vanity and folly, but they were also fierce defenders of territory. Loud, vain, unapologetic, that was the jester's armor. The bells, too, had purpose, not just for comedy. They jingled to announce his presence. In a world of secrets and whispers, the jester was rarely subtle. He entered a room already ringing, making noise that said, "I see everything. I'm allowed everywhere. And I will speak, even if no one else dares." Some jesters wore marottes, small staffs topped with a carved wooden head that looked like themselves, a tiny mirror of the fool. It was a companion, a prop, a puppet, but also a statement. I am double. I am voice and echo. I am show and shadow. The marotte could say what even the jester couldn't. It could insult more boldly. It could interrupt more freely. It was the jester's mischief unchained. And yet, beneath all this brightness, there was caution. Every stitch of motley was a gamble. Every bell was a risk, because the outfit that gave a jester his freedom could also become his noose. In times of peace, motley was beloved. The jester strolled openly, told stories at supper, danced for bored duchesses. But in times of war or scandal, when the king grew quiet and the queen's eyes narrowed, motley could become dangerous. A flash of red or gold, too bold, too bright, and suddenly the jester was drawing attention he didn't want. There are stories, whispered, through old texts, of jesters whose costumes were stripped from them, their bells silenced, their motley burned. Sometimes it was symbolic, a warning. Other times it marked their fall from favor. A jester without his colors was nothing, no more protected, no more free. And yet still they wore it, because motley was more than fabric. It was identity. It was a spell, a disguise, a contract with the court. I will entertain you, provoke you, maybe even teach you, but you must let me live. Even now, centuries later, when we imagine a jester, we don't remember their words first. We remember their clothes, that patchwork chaos, that silly hat. The way they seemed to burst into the room like a living question mark. Motley is a kind of magic. A costume that says, nothing is sacred, and everything can be laughed at, especially power. So picture that again. The jester, early in the morning, carefully pulling his sleeves over his wrists, smoothing the patches flat, adjusting his hat just so, not just dressing, but preparing, armoring himself in absurdity, making himself visible and invisible, powerful and pitiful, dangerous and delightful. With every bell tied, every ribbon fastened, he becomes the jester again. A figure you cannot mistake. A man or woman who walks into the court already marked by color, already announcing, you may call me a fool, but I know who the real fools are. And somewhere in the castle, the king stirs. The feast will soon begin. The jester fastens the last bell, and with a grin that is part joy and part survival, he steps out into the corridor, motley blazing like stained glass in the morning light. Let yourself rest in that image. Bright colors in grey stone, soft jingling in silence, the dance between danger and delight, and the sound of footsteps drawing closer to the throne. The jester's most dangerous weapon was not a blade or a staff, or even the gleam of his clever eyes. It was his tongue, not just for jokes, or riddles, or rhymes, though he used it for those, certainly, but for something far more subtle, for navigating the treacherous, shifting tides of royal emotion, for walking the invisible line between laughter and offense, truth and treason. A jester, more than anything, had to understand the room, and not just understand it, control it, bend it, soften it, turn it on itself. A jest, after all, is not always light. It can cut, a rhyme can reveal, a pun can poison. A story told at just the right moment, with just the right lilt, can steer the direction of an entire conversation. In a court where everyone else bowed, where words were measured and rehearsed, the jester's speech was chaotic on the surface, but deeply intentional underneath. While nobles flattered, the jester teased. While others remained silent in fear, the jester spoke, but only if he could make it sound like a joke, and that was the art. Imagine the jester at court, perched on a low stool or leaning casually against a carved pillar. A lord has just finished speaking, perhaps offering some lofty opinion about war or trade or some noble feud. The room is tense. The king frowns. The queen stirs. The jester clears his throat, slowly, loud enough to be noticed. I once knew a man who loved the sound of his own voice so much, the jester says lightly, he married it. The wedding was lovely. The conversation at dinner was one-sided. Laughter, soft, at first, then louder. The lord reddens. But the moment has passed. The tension breaks, and the king smiles. That is the power of the fool's tongue, to diffuse, without submission, to offend without consequence, to mock without rebellion. And yet it was never truly safe, because the jester had no rank, no title, no shield but humor. If the king's mood turned, if the joke landed wrong, if a powerful earl decided he'd had enough, the jester could be punished, banished, or worse. That power to speak, that rare permission to tease, was always lent, never owned. It could be revoked in a moment, but still they spoke. They turned political speeches into poems. They rewrote scandals as ballads. They crafted clever dialogues in which kings and courtiers became animals, foxes, pigs, roosters, acting out the follies of the court under the safety of metaphor. One jester might compose a news report in rhyme, delivering the week's gossip with a twinkle in his eye. Another might engage in quip battles, rapid-fire exchanges of insult and wit, where the loser was shamed and the winner earned applause, or at least survival. And still others, sangy ballads full of innuendo, satire, and double meaning, pretending to praise while clearly criticizing. A line might sound harmless until the third or fourth repetition, when the court finally caught the joke and laughed or gasped. And if they were truly gifted, truly golden, the jester could walk a circle around the king, mocking his robe, his decisions, even his family, and emerge not only unscathed, but rewarded. Why? Because the jester said what others dared not. He let the king see himself, the absurdity of his decisions, the vanity of his courtiers, the fragility of his power, and still managed to make him laugh. And in doing so, the jester became more than entertainer. He became an advisor, a compass, a conscience. One story tells of Will Somers, jester to Henry VIII, who once joked about the king's excessive taxes. Instead of being punished, he was thanked. Somers had said aloud what the nobles wouldn't dare, and gave Henry a moment to step back and save face. Another tells of Triboulet, jester to King Francis I of France, who insulted a noble and was sentenced to death. The king, in a twisted moment of mercy, allowed Triboulet to choose how he would die. Without missing a beat, the jester replied, by old age. The king laughed and spared him. These moments are legendary not because the jesters were lucky, but because they were skilled, razor-sharp minds hidden beneath bells and laughter. Survivors in a world that rewarded silence and punished truth, and yet they chose to speak. So if you ever think of a jester as a fool, remember, they weren't called jesters because they were silly. They were called jesters because they jested, and jesting in a royal court was a language of power. Their words could carry secrets, could shift alliances, could crack through pride. They were jesters, yes, but also poets, diplomats, spies, and sages, with no armor but wit, number, sword but a sharp tongue, no shield but a grin. Let your breath soften now. Let the voices in the court drift into quiet. The jester steps away from the throne, his voice still echoing faintly through the hall, teasing, warning, laughing, and somewhere behind that laughter, truth waits, asterisk. The jester lives by laughter, but what happens when no one laughs? Imagine a long stone hall. The candles are burning low. The feast has dragged on. The nobles are half drunk and full of meat. The air is thick, not just with smoke, but with boredom, with irritation, with silence. And then the jester steps forward. A glimmer of bells, a sweep of motley, a burst of color in a room gone cold. He tries, he tells a story, he sings a song, he spins a tale about the bishop's donkey, and the queen's new jewels, and the night the cook fell in the moat. Laughter stirs here and there, but not from the throne. The king does not smile. The queen stares at her goblet. A single spoon clinks on the edge of a plate, and suddenly the jester feels it. That invisible shift, that creeping danger, 1,000 eyes watching, no one breathing. And the joke, once light as air, now lands like a stone in the belly of the room. He laughs, alone, too loud, too late, because that is the danger of the joke, that the joke is a blade, and sometimes it cuts the wrong way. You see, the jester's power was never his own. It was borrowed, lent, conditional, and when a king was in a good mood, the jester could mock him to the moon and back. But if The king had lost a battle, or buried a son, or quarrelled with his council. The air changed, the rules bent, the leash tightened, and the joke became a threat. Sometimes the punishment was mild. A jester might be slapped, sent to the kitchens, made to sleep with the dogs, denied wine, denied audience. Other times it was harsher. Some were whipped publicly, made to apologize before the court, the fool humbled and silenced. Some were banished, stripped of their motley, cast out of the castle. No longer protected, no longer useful. A jester with no court is a candle with no flame, still shaped like it should be bright, but unable to shine. And some were killed. Not often, not publicly, but in the old texts, in the forgotten corners of court records, there are hints, quiet references, a name struck from the rolls, a jester who disappeared, one whose tongue proved too clever for his own good. There are stories of kings who laughed until they didn't, of jokes that mirrored the wrong truth, of satirical verses that hit too close to home, and yet the jesters kept joking, because the danger wasn't just in the joke, it was in the silence. In a court full of sycophants and schemers, the jester was often the only one who could say the thing that needed saying, the only one who could break the spell of power, and so they risked it. They joked about war when others would only cheer. They teased the queen when the dukes bowed low. They named names in riddles, in rhymes, in song, and they danced on the edge of exile, or worse. One clever jest might earn a new cloak, another might earn a black eye. It was never certain. The jester played roulette with every rhyme. His words were dice, his grin a mask, but there were tricks. Of course, ways to cushion the blow. Jesters used ambiguity, letting the joke land with multiple meanings. If one offended, they could insist, "Oh no, I meant the other thing." They used mimicry, imitating not directly but closely enough to stir laughter and suspicion without proof. They used animals, replacing people in stories with pigs, foxes, and owls. That fox who eats all the hens might be the king's advisor, or the king himself. They used song, because it's easier to forgive a joke if it's sung sweetly, or hidden in a round with a pretty refrain. Still, none of these were foolproof. One frown from the monarch, one sideways glance from a noble, one cough from a bishop, and the jester knew the joke had gone wrong. It didn't always mean punishment, but it meant the jester would spend the night wide awake, replaying every word, wondering what tomorrow would bring. Because, in the world of courts, favor was fleeting, and a jester, no matter how beloved, was only ever one bad punchline from the gallows. That's what made the laughter so sharp, so urgent, so electric, because beneath every giggle was a gamble, and every audience was a trial. So when you imagine a jester, don't just see the silly grin and bouncing bells. See the tension, the risk, the mind racing behind the madness. The nerves beneath the mask see the danger, cloaked in delight, and see the silence that cold, hard silence that followed when the king didn't laugh. Let that silence settle for a moment. Let the tension unravel. The torches burn low. The court empties. The jester walks back to his quarters, the echo of his own voice still ringing in his ears. Not every joke lands. Not every night ends with applause. But tomorrow he'll rise again. He'll try again. Because that's what jesters do. They dare. They speak. They smile, even on the edge of a blade. Beneath the clatter of goblets and the lilting notes of the lute, Behind the curtains of courtly drama, something quiet was always unfolding. A glance, a whisper, a scrap of parchment passed from one sleeve to another, and in the middle of it, all unnoticed, or rather ignored, was the jester. He juggled apples, he mocked the night, he stumbled purposefully into the Duchess's skirts, and all the while he watched. The jester was everywhere. At the feast, at the gate, in the antechamber before meetings, in the corridor as nobles passed with lowered voices, in the king's private study, playing softly while important letters were written. And because he was the fool, because he was dismissed, underestimated, laughed at, he saw everything. He was, in a sense, the perfect spy. Not all jesters were informants, but many were, and some didn't even know they were doing it. A clever jester might drop a detail to a guard who passed it to a chamberlain who passed it to the queen. A well-timed song might stir a reaction in a noble, revealing something meant to be hidden. A joke, aimed just right, could confirm a rumor, or expose one. And sometimes, the jester did it on purpose, not out of malice, usually, but out of survival, because knowledge was power, and in the court, power was protection. The jester who knew who was sleeping with whom, who was plotting what, who had debts or secrets or enemies, that jester lived a little longer, because the king always needs someone who knows, someone who sees without being seen, someone who hears without being feared. And the jester could whisper something and make it sound like nonsense, could confess the truth wrapped in a riddle, could spill a secret in rhyme and walk away clean. My lord's daughter has a lover, or so says the maid, who speaks to the cook, who whispers to the fool, who dreams too loudly and remembers too well. It's just a poem, right? Just a silly rhyme, unless it's not. Some kings used their jesters as deliberate informants, not only to gather intelligence, but to deliver it. A message passed through a jester's joke was easier to stomach. Truth, hidden in laughter, was harder to trace. The fool, after all, wasn't a courtier. He had no army, no estate, no ambition to climb, just bells and rhymes and secrets that made him safe, or at least safer than the others. There's a tale not confirmed, but often told, of a jester in the Spanish court who once uncovered a plot to poison the king. He said nothing directly. He simply entered the hall one night and refused to eat or drink. When asked why, he replied, "Because I am no king, and I am not thirsty enough to die." The room froze. The king's goblet paused mid-air, and the cupbearer was quietly replaced. Coincidence? Perhaps. But jesters knew how to send messages without saying them, how to hint without accusing, how to reveal without pointing. They also knew how to listen, because in the silence between the songs, in the laughter between the lines, people spoke freely. Nobles talked as if the jester were furniture. Guards gossiped while the fool slept nearby. Servants whispered, thinking the fool wouldn't understand. But he always did. And sometimes in dark moments, the jester chose sides. He might pass messages from one noble to another, might serve as a go-between for lovers or traitors, might warn the queen of a plot, or tell the king of a betrayal, because the jester had access, unarmed, unranked, unthreatening. But everywhere and everywhere ... is a dangerous place to be. Some jesters were caught, accused of knowing too much, accused of playing both sides, accused of treachery, whether true or not, and because they were jesters, they had few defenders. "I'm only the fool," they might protest. I only told a joke, but even jokes have edges. Even laughter has teeth. And one suspicion fell on a jester. The bells on his cap began to sound less like music and more like warning. Yet others, the truly masterful, walked the line perfectly. They fed the king just enough truth to stay useful. They hinted at threats without naming names. They made themselves indispensable, but never too bold, because the key was balance. A jester who knew too little was forgettable, replaceable. A jester who knew too much, dangerous, disposable. But a jester who knew just enough was golden. So picture him now, strolling the courtyard after dark, pretending to chase a cat or hum a tune. His eyes are sharp, his ears are open. A scrap of gossip clings to his sleeve, and tomorrow it might become a song. Not because he is cruel, but because he must. Because a jester's life is not protected by bloodline or coin or armor. It is protected by relevance, and sometimes the only way to stay alive is to know more than anyone else. Let your thoughts settle now. Let the whispers fade. The jester walks on, silent now, his bells stilled. He knows too much to sleep, but you may rest. There's still more to see, but not just yet. Let's begin with stillness. A quiet room, stone walls, rough but warm in the early light. A wool blanket pulled up to the chin. A chest rises and falls, slowly. A jester sleeps, curled on his side, one leg stiff from old injury. His hands are strong, but his fingers curl in ways that never quite straighten. His hip aches. It always does, especially when the rain is coming. This is a side of jesters, rarely painted in tapestries or told in the songs. But it is real, and it is important. Many jesters in royal courts were chosen, not for their training or charm, but because they were different. Not just different in temperament, but in body or mind. People with physical disabilities, people with dwarfism, people who spoke or moved or thought in ways that others didn't understand, and in a world that often feared difference. Sometimes the court brought them in, sometimes to protect, sometimes to mock, often for both. The term natural fool was used in medieval Europe to describe jesters who were seen as having intellectual or cognitive differences. They were thought to be foolish by nature, not performance. And unlike the artificial fools, those who memorized jokes and crafted songs, natural fools were simply themselves. Courts found them fascinating, sometimes endearing, sometimes cruelly amusing. They might be dressed in bright colors and brought out at feasts to do little more than clap, laugh, or speak strangely. They were rarely trained, rarely in control of how or when they performed. Some, however, were deeply loved, protected, given rooms and food and care, something they might not have had elsewhere. The court, for all its politics, could be a strange sanctuary, a place where difference wasn't hidden away but placed, however, problematically in the center. But that didn't mean it was easy. Pain was a quiet thread running through the jester's life. Pain in the joints, pain in the stomach, pain in the heart. Some jesters had chronic illnesses, unseen but ever present. Others carried emotional pain, of exile, of abandonment, of being laughed at without being heard. Imagine trying to make a king laugh while your legs tremble. Imagine singing while your back spasms. Imagine being asked to dance again and again, though your feet are blistered and the bells on your ankles cut your skin, and yet they danced. not always out of joy, sometimes out of survival, sometimes out of duty, sometimes because it was the one thing that made them visible, the one thing that made the pain worthwhile. Some jesters made their difference, their power, a woman with a hunchback might exaggerate it in her dance, turning each curve into theatre. A man with a speech delay might use rhythm to master timing, turning pauses into punchlines. A child with tics might be taught songs where the tics became beats, echoes, unique and unforgettable, and the best of them, the bravest of them, made audiences laugh, not at them, but with them. They redirected the attention, turned the gaze, took the thing others would pity, and made it the punchline, on their own terms. One such jester, known only in fragments of history, was said to walk with a strange limp, the result of a childhood illness, but he turned it into a signature. Every entrance, every joke, every dance began with the same long, sweeping stride and a theatrical stumble. It became expected, beloved, a cue that the laughter was about to begin. But when the laughter ended, the pain remained, and yet they did it all again the next day, because the jester, perhaps more than anyone else at court, understood that survival meant adapting. It meant turning weakness into rhythm. It meant making space for yourself when none was given. It meant learning to laugh through clenched teeth, and to move through rooms that weren't built for you. It meant becoming more than what others assumed, and still, amid all this, some jesters found joy, found love, found friendship. Not every moment was hardship. There were feasts and songs, yes, but also quiet mornings, shared jokes with the cook, a warm cloak from a kind hand, a stolen kiss behind the tapestries. They were not only their pain, they were not only their roles, they were, like all people, complicated, beautiful, strange, whole. So, when you imagine a jester, do not imagine perfection, do not imagine flawless dance or sharp-tongued wit alone. Imagine the limp, the lisp, the scar. Imagine the patience, the grit, the humor that comes from having been through something. Imagine the jester as someone who has survived, not just the court, but the world. Someone who found a way to turn pain into performance, to turn silence into song, to turn rejection into applause. And now, let yourself rest. Let the aching limbs stretch long and slow. Let the stiff joints soften. Let the breath deepen. And picture the jester sitting by the fire now, sipping something warm, feet bare, hat removed, a quiet smile on a tired face. He's done enough for today. So have you. Sleep gently. Not all fools wore motley, not all jesters served kings. Some walked barefoot through holy places. Some sang songs to no one but the sky. Some were fools for God. They were called holy fools. You'll find them not in the castles of France or the palaces of England, but in churches and deserts, in monasteries and market squares. They wandered through history like ghosts in human skin, half mad, half saint, entirely baffling. Their roots run deepest in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, especially in Russia, where they were known as Eurodivi, God's fools. These men and women rejected wealth, comfort, and decorum. They dressed in rags. They said strange things. They behaved in ways that confused, annoyed, even offended polite society. But the faithful believed. They saw more than others, because they were not just jesters. They were prophets in disguise. One such holy fool was Saint Basil the Blessed, the man for whom Moscow's famous cathedral is named. He was said to have gone naked in winter, thrown rocks at the rich, stolen food from merchants, only to give it to beggars, and still the Tsar trembled before him. Why? Because Basil saw through things. He called out corruption. He told the truth no one else dared. And he wrapped it all in strangeness, so they couldn't kill him for it. That was the trick, by acting like a fool. The holy fool avoided persecution. He was untouchable, unpredictable. He made rulers laugh one moment and squirm the next. His absurdity was his armor, his madness a mask for wisdom. But the role wasn't easy. Holy fools often lived in poverty. They were ridiculed, beaten, exiled. Some were jailed, others starved. And yet they persisted, because their foolishness wasn't a costume, it was a calling. And their message was simple. This world is upside down. Power is an illusion. Riches mean nothing. God loves the weak and the strange and the silly. Their behavior reflected this truth. They flipped tables, slept in church porches, ate from the ground, interrupted liturgies with strange chants or dances. They were clowns. Yes, but clowns with fire in their bones. And they weren't just in Russia. You'd find echoes of them across Byzantine lands, in Ireland, where madmen wandered the hills in ecstatic prayer, in Italy, where fools for Christ lived on the margins of society, whispering sacred riddles, even in Islamic mysticism. There are tales of saints who acted strangely, laughed at themselves, challenged the wise with nonsense, all to remind people not to take the world too seriously. The point was not to mock God. The point was to mock human pride, to strip away the seriousness that can so easily rot into arrogance, to laugh in the face of fear, to act silly in the face of death, to remind everyone through absurdity what truly matters. Sometimes these holy fools were welcomed, respected, even canonized. Other times they were chased with sticks, called mad, forgotten. But their legacy remained, and in many ways their role mirrored that of the court jester. Both spoke truth wrapped in performance. Both challenged power without openly rebelling. Both existed outside the expected, outside the rules, and both knew sometimes the best way to reach the heart is through laughter. Because laughter, real laughter, not mockery, not cruelty, but joy disarms us. It softens the armor. It opens the door, and in that opening, something holy can enter. Imagine one now, a fool in rags, barefoot on stone. Streets, he sings a strange song to a statue. Children giggle, priests frown. A beggar bows his head. The fool bows too, not to the statue, but to the beggar. He whispers something, a riddle perhaps, or maybe a prayer. Then he walks away, arms outstretched, spinning like a top, laughing at the sky. And in that moment, you can't help but wonder, does he know something we don't? Let your thoughts rest there on the edge of madness and mystery, on the border between comedy and holiness, where the holy fool stands, smiling, watching, waiting for us to stop pretending we have it all figured out, and maybe to laugh with him. Until now, we've wandered through shadows and echoes, through stories pieced together from fragments and folklore. But some jesters left clearer footprints, names, records, stories passed down not just through legend, but through royal ledgers, paintings and letters. Let's meet them now. Not all of them, just a few. The ones who became more than jokes. The ones who stood beside kings and queens and shaped history softly. Will Summers, the gentle fool of Henry Viowy, begin in Tudor England. In the early 1500s, with a quiet man in motley, Will Sommers wasn't loud or wild. He didn't leap from tables or throw food or insult dukes with flair. His gift was quieter. He was kind, clever, and most important of all, trusted. Will entered King Henry VIII's court around 1525 and stayed through 4 monarchs: Henry, then Edward, Vi, Mary Vi, and finally Elizabeth I. That alone is astonishing. Few nobles lasted that long, but the fool did. Why? Because Will knew how to read a room, and more than that, how to read a king. Henry VIII, as you may know, was not a gentle man. He executed 2 of his 6 wives. He broke from the Pope. He crushed rebellions, but Sommers, he survived. He joked with Henry in private. He walked beside him during dark days, when the king was sick and angry and swollen with pain. He was the only one who could tease him without fear, the only one who could cheer him when even courtiers dared not speak. Sommers once reportedly told the king, "You have so many ministers, you ought to have one more, a hangman," and Henry laughed. It wasn't just the joke, it was the timing, the trust, the balance. Will was more than entertainment. He was a mirror, a friend, a steady presence in a dangerous place. When Henry died, Sommers served his children. Even Queen Elizabeth, sharp as she was, allowed him to remain. He appears in paintings tucked behind the throne, bells on his cap, face calm, always there. Always watching, no scandals, no disgrace, just quiet loyalty and wit. And a life remarkably long for a man who spoke truth to power. Candlelit, the savage fool of France, now crossed the Channel into the court of Francis I of France. The Renaissance is in full bloom, and so is Candlelit. If Sommers was gentle, Candlelit was the opposite. Wickedly sharp, rude, brazen, and absolutely beloved. He insulted everyone, called nobles fat chickens in lace, mocked the queens. Fashion teased foreign ambassadors in front of their hosts. And Francis, he encouraged it, because behind the venom was brilliance. Candlelit was a master of satire. He composed biting verse, quick repartee, and theatrical pranks that left the court in hysterics, unless they were the target. And even then, they often couldn't help but laugh. But he pushed too far once. He insulted a powerful courtier, the wrong one, and the noble demanded his execution. Francis, caught in a trap of courtly politics, reluctantly agreed. With a catch, he told Candlelit. "You may choose how you wish to die." Without missing a beat, the fool replied, "Of old age." The king laughed so hard he rescinded the sentence. That was the power of a perfect joke. Candlelit lived, and went right back to jesting. He was, by all accounts, physically different. Some say he had a spinal condition or a gait that was unusual. But he used, that turned it into part of the act. A mask, a shield, a hook. He died sometime in the mid-1500s, but his legend lived on. Even Victor Hugo wrote about him centuries later. Candlelit wasn't just a fool. He was fire wrapped in bells, danger disguised as laughter, and the court hungry for entertainment, thirsty for truth, could not get enough. Jane, the fool, the jester of Queensland. Now we turn to Jane. Not many remember her name, but she was there. At the courts of Catherine Parr, the last wife of Henry VIII. Then, at the side of Mary I, the queen known as Bloody Mary, Jane the Fool was a woman, rare, though not unheard of. She may have been what they called a natural fool, or she may have been an artificial one, who played the role. We don't know for sure, but she appears again and again in records, dressed in motley, attending the Queen, speaking in rhymes, cared for, protected. Some suggest she had learning disabilities. Others argue she was a sharp performer, hidden behind simplicity. Either way, the Queens kept her close. She travelled with the royal household, was fed and clothed and guarded, and when she was injured once, pushed during a fight, it was recorded with concern. She mattered in portraits. She sometimes appears at the edge, half obscured, looking out with wide eyes. Not quite the centre, but never far. We don't know her full story, but we know she was there, watching, listening, surviving. A woman in motley, living through one of England's most dangerous dynasties, and making people smile, in spite of everything. So now, as you drift deeper into stillness, remember them, Will, who survived by gentleness, Tribalette, who survived by audacity, Jane, who survived by simply being herself. They were jesters, yes, but also witnesses to history, to grief, to beauty, to madness. They saw kings rise and queens fall. They heard the whispers behind the throne, and they made the world laugh, even when the world was on fire. Let your thoughts quiet now. Let these faces fade gently into the mist. The bells fall silent. The halls go dark. And still, somewhere in history, a jester bows the fool, remembers everything. When most people picture a court jester, they picture a man, a wiry trickster with a painted grin, a clever boy juggling apples, or a sharp-tongued fellow leaning too close to the king's ear. But what if the jester had a braid tucked beneath her cap? What if the laughter came from a woman? They were there, not many, but enough. Women who joked, danced, teased, and dared. Women who played the fool, and played it well. Some were recorded. Others faded into footnotes, or were mistaken for servants, or simply erased. But tonight, let's bring them forward. Jane, the fool again. And the quiet power of Presence Wife met Jane the fool already. She served Catherine Parr, Mary, and likely even Elizabeth I. She wore motley. She was paid, protected, cared for. She travelled with the queens, appeared in court records, appeared in royal company. We don't know what she said. We don't know her jokes, but we know this: 3 queens kept her close. And in courts where women were watched, measured, judged, Jane made space for herself. She existed visibly. She laughed. She survived. Women in disguise in some courts. Women jesters were hired outright. In others, they appeared as masqueraders, dressed in men's clothing, stepping into the role for a night, a feast, a moment. Some played fools in court masks, elaborate performances of music and satire, where women could briefly speak with boldness under a painted mask. And in those performances, some stayed. A few were retained as jesters in residence, particularly in Spanish and Italian courts, where theatrical traditions blurred the lines between actor and fool. Methorian, the Amazon jester of France there, was a woman named Methorian, who served in the French court in the late 1500s. She wore armor, yes, armor, like an Amazon warrior. She carried a wooden sword. She played the fool as a fighter, striding through the court like a parody of a soldier. But she wasn't just comic relief. In 1594, when a would-be assassin tried to reach the king, Methorian tackled him. She stopped the attack, protected the monarch, with her wooden sword and her sharp instincts. She wasn't just funny, she was fierce, foolish, or feminine. The role of the jester was, in many ways, ungendered, or better yet, regendered. A fool could mock masculinity, imitate a knight, mimic a priest. A female jester could flip those tropes, playing the flirt, the crone, the spinster, the siren, sometimes all in one performance. But still, it was harder. Women in motley were more vulnerable, more scrutinized, sometimes more fetishized. A man acting a fool might be called clever, a woman called mad, and yet they persisted. They learned how to spin words just as fast, how to dance without being dismissed, how to tease the lords and charm the ladies. Some were loved, some were tolerated, some were cast out, and some vanished from the record entirely, though the echoes of their laughter may still ring between the lines of old texts. The gendered masks, the jester's costume was already a costume of freedom. Motley, in a sense, gave cover. You weren't noble or servant, not quite man or woman. You were the fool. And that meant you could say things no one else could say, ask questions no one else could ask. A woman in motley could flirt with the prince, mock the duchess, correct the bishop, all while spinning in circles and speaking in verse. She wasn't a threat, she was entertainment. But make no mistake, that power was real, and it was hard-won. Now picture her, a woman in patchwork cloth, hair tucked up beneath, her jester's cap, one earring glinting in the candlelight. She raises her voice in song, a bawdy rhyme that makes the courtiers howl with laughter, and then, quietly, she slips a line into the second verse, a truth, a criticism, a secret. Only the queen hears, only the king frowns, only the jester smiles. She has done it again, and they'll never see her coming. Let your thoughts slow, let the flickering candle fade. Somewhere in a long-forgotten hall, a woman in motley dances in the shadows. She curtsies low, and she vanishes just before dawn. The court jester made people laugh. That much is obvious. But what's less obvious, and far more dangerous, is this. The jester could also shape what people thought, with rhyme, with parody, with story, with just a few clever words delivered. At the right moment, the fool could turn public opinion, could embarrass an enemy, could change a king's mind, could influence the court's entire mood. This wasn't always the goal, but it was always the risk, because words, in a world where most people couldn't read and most truths were whispered, were power. And the jester, for all their silliness, wielded them like a blade wrapped in feathers. Humor as messaging. Gay jester didn't have to say, "This war is wrong." Instead, they told a joke about how the king's horse was afraid of battle, or how the treasury was so empty the mice were applying for work. The room would laugh, but they'd remember, because satire lingers. It entertains while it educates. It spreads while it disguises. Mockery as soft protests sometimes. The fool said what no adviser dared. He taxes the poor, a minister might mutter in private. But the jester, he might stand in the middle of the feast and sing. The rich eat meat, the poor eat bones. The king counts coin while the widow moans. And suddenly, everyone's laughing, but everyone's also thinking, was that just a rhyme or a warning? The answer, both. And that's where the jester lived, in that thin line between jest and judgment, a mouthpiece for the crowns. The court jester served another purpose entirely, as a mouthpiece for the monarch. If the king wanted to mock a rival, stir up gossip, test an idea, he might let the jester say it first. After all, if the jester says it and the court laughs, maybe it's safe to move forward. But if the room goes cold, well, it was just a joke, just a fool, nothing to worry about. This plausible deniability made jesters perfect tools for propaganda, a song about a noble's greed, a sketch mocking a rival kingdom's army, a tale about a queen's alleged affair, all delivered in jest, all echoed around the room, all remembered. The courtroom of Laughter Court was a place of ceremony, of hierarchy, of silence and spectacle. But when the jester performed, everything flipped. He could call out a bishop for corruption. He could joke about the queen's dowry. He could poke holes in the king's policy. And everyone for a moment could let themselves feel what they were not allowed to say. That is political release, a safety valve, a momentary rebellion wrapped in entertainment, and sometimes a not-so-temporary one. The dangers of influence, of course. This power came at a price. A jester who pushed the message too far might be accused of sedition, of treason, of corrupting the court's morals, of stirring the pot. Sometimes they were just exiled. Other times, worse, because while kings liked jokes that made others look foolish, they didn't always enjoy being the target. And if a jester became too beloved, too bold, too clever, they became a threat, and threats do not last long. At court, the clever ones knew the truly skilled jesters. They played all sides. They knew when to push, when to pull back. They joked about taxes, but also about lazy nobles. They teased the king, and then flattered him in the next breath. They kept everyone just a little bit uncertain, a little bit off balance, and that uncertainty gave them freedom. So as you picture the jester now, don't just see a fool with a puppet. See a strategist, a voice, a living newspaper, a singer of satire, a whisperer of opinion, a tool of propaganda and protest alike. See him or her standing in the center of the room, telling a joke that gets 100 people laughing, and a dozen thinking, and one person, one powerful person, frowning just slightly because the words hit too close. Let that moment hang in the air. A court full of smiles, and one shadow at the head table, a jester twirling in the firelight, a rhyme still echoing, and somewhere beneath the bells and song, the quiet thrum of truth, disguised as comedy. Let that truth fade, for now. Let the court sleep. Let the jester bow low. Every jester, no matter how beloved, no matter how careful, lived with one truth, one joke too far, and it's all over. The motley, the meals, the place at the king's side, it could vanish in a moment. All it took was one laugh that didn't land, one truth too sharp, one secret to public, one smile that didn't rise on the king's lips, because favor in a royal court was not a sturdy thing. It was a breeze, a flicker, a hand turned inward just slightly, and suddenly everything changed. The ticking clock for the jester. The fall didn't always come with trumpets or shouted accusations. It might start small. The king stops asking for you at meals. The queen no longer chuckles at your jokes. You're no longer called forward at the feast. Your name falls from the ledgers of payment. And just like that, you begin to disappear sometimes. It was temporary. A scandal you joked about too soon. A noble you mocked who turned out to be a cousin. A song that reminded the king of something he wanted to forget. Other times, it was permanent. The price of being too honest. There are stories, whispered and half lost, of jesters who spoke too clearly. One sang about a war that had cost too many lives. Another mimicked a bishop's greed, while the bishop still held the king's ear. A third mocked the queen's new dress, not knowing it was a gift from a foreign ally. The punishment varied. Some were whipped and returned to service, quieter than before. Some were cast out with only the clothes they wore. And a few, too bold, too sharp, too inconvenient, were imprisoned or disappeared altogether. Their names vanished from the books. Their songs stopped echoing, and the court, as it always does, moved on. The emotional fall, but sometimes the fall from favor wasn't about politics. Sometimes the king just stopped needing you. You'd done your job, lightened the dark. Years helped him laugh through grief. But now he had a new queen, a new advisor, a new fool, younger and louder, juggling better than you ever did. Suddenly, your presence became uncomfortable. A reminder of the past, of old wounds, of jokes no longer funny. You might be sent to a country estate, given a pension, a room, and silence. And for a fool who lived for the court's heat and fire, the silence was worse than exile. Aging out for some, the fall came with age. Knees stiff, fingers aching, voice cracking. The jokes slowed, the leaps grew smaller. The court stopped noticing, and that too was a fall, because a jester was always one thing first: entertainment. And when the show ends, the fool fades. Unless, of course, he found another way. Some became tutors, some kept diaries, some faded into legend, their motley hung beside old swords and royal robes, and some quietly, gracefully walked away, but not forgotten even when they fell. The best jesters left a mark, a phrase the nobles repeated, a tune the cooks hummed, a story passed from page to page. They lingered, not as nobles, not as soldiers, but as something deeper: memory, tone, atmosphere. The court had changed them, and they had changed the court for a time. So picture it now: a jester, older now, sitting on a bench near the stables. His bells no longer ring, his motley packed away. He watches the torches being lit for another feast, one he won't attend. And yet he smiles, because he remembers, because he once stood in the center, because he once made the king laugh so hard he wept. And that moment, that power, can never be taken away. Let your breath grow soft, let your thoughts drift. The feast goes on, the music plays, and in the shadows a fool hums along softly, still watching, still knowing, still there. Every jester, no matter how beloved, no matter how careful, lived with one truth, one joke too far, and it's all over. The motley, the meals, the place at the king's side, it could vanish in a moment. All it took was one laugh that didn't land, one truth too sharp, one secret too public, one smile that didn't rise on the king's lips. Because favor in a royal court was not a sturdy thing. It was a breeze, a flicker, a hand turned inward just slightly, and suddenly everything changed. The ticking clock for the jester. The fall didn't always come with trumpets or shouted accusations. It might start small. The king stops asking for you at meals. The queen no longer chuckles at your jokes. You're no longer called forward at the feast. Your name falls from the ledgers of payment. And just like that, you begin to disappear sometimes. It was temporary. A scandal you joked about too soon. A noble you mocked who turned out to be a cousin. a song that reminded the king of something he wanted to forget. Other times, it was permanent. The price of being too honest. There are stories, whispered and half lost, of jesters who spoke too clearly. One sang about a war that had cost too many lives. Another mimicked a bishop's greed, while the bishop still held the king's ear. A third mocked the queen's new dress, not knowing it was a gift from a foreign ally. The punishment varied. Some were whipped and returned to service, quieter than before. Some were cast out with only the clothes they wore. And a few, too bold, too sharp, too inconvenient, were imprisoned or disappeared altogether. Their names vanished from the books. Their songs stopped echoing, and the court, as it always does, moved on. The emotional fall, but sometimes the fall from favor wasn't about politics. Sometimes the king just stopped needing you. You'd done your job, lightened the dark. Years helped him laugh through grief. But now he had a new queen, a new advisor, a new fool, younger and louder, juggling better than you ever did. Suddenly, your presence became uncomfortable. A reminder of the past, of old wounds, of jokes no longer funny. You might be sent to a country estate, given a pension, a room, and silence. And for a fool who lived for the court's heat and fire, the silence was worse than exile. Aging out for some, the fall came with age. Knees stiff, fingers aching, voice cracking. The jokes slowed, the leaps grew smaller. The court stopped noticing, and that too was a fall, because a jester was always one thing first: entertainment. And when the show ends, the fool fades. Unless, of course, he found another way. Some became tutors, some kept diaries, some faded into legend, their motley hung beside old swords and royal robes. And some, quietly, gracefully, walked away, but not forgotten even when they fell. The best jesters left a mark, a phrase the nobles repeated, a tune the cooks hummed, a story passed from page to page. They lingered, not as nobles, not as soldiers, but as something deeper: memory, tone, atmosphere. The court had changed them, and they had changed the court, for a time. So picture it now. A jester, older now, sitting on a bench near the stables. His bells no longer ring, his motley packed away. He watches the torches being lit for another feast, one he won't attend, and yet he smiles because he remembers, because he once stood in the center, because he once made the king laugh so hard he wept. And that moment, that power can never be taken away. Let your breath grow soft, let your thoughts drift. The feast goes on, the music plays, and in the shadows a fool hums along softly, still watching, still knowing, still there. The court jester, as we've seen him so far, often wears bells and motley. He serves a king or queen. He jokes, juggles, sings, and survives by his wit. But what if we shift the scene? What if the castle walls melt into clay houses, temples, steppe, pyramids, or desert tents? What if the jester's voice is softer, a flute instead of a rhyme, or louder, a mask instead of a wink? Because around the world, through centuries and civilizations, the spirit of the jester has appeared again and again, not always with the name fool, not always in courts, but always with that strange power to entertain, to challenge, to reflect. Let's wander a while, slowly, let's meet them one by one. China, you, she, and the jesters of the Qin court. Long before medieval Europe crowned its kings, imperial China had emperors, And where there are emperors, there are jesters. One of the oldest and cleverest was Yu Shi, Jester to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor to unify China. He wasn't just a clown, he was a political buffer, a trickster advisor, a truth-teller in silk slippers, when ministers were too afraid to correct the emperor. Yu Shi told jokes instead, jokes that revealed flaws, errors, or dangerous plans. One story says he used satire to dissuade the emperor from flooding a valley. The emperor laughed. The project was cancelled. He saved lives with comedy. India Vidushaka, the wise clown in ancient Sanskrit theatre. There is always a Vidushaka, a comic companion to the noble hero. He is fat, gluttonous, loud. He mispronounces words, mixes languages. But behind the silliness, he's wise. He is the only one who can challenge the prince. He sees through illusions. He breaks the fourth wall and speaks to the audience. The Vidushaka is not a court jester in name, but in spirit, sacred, silly, and untouchable. He is humor with a soul. Russia, the Uradev, or holy fools, we met them before the Uradev. Wandering saints, wrapped in madness. They weren't entertainers, not exactly, but they mocked power. They confused the powerful. They turned cities upside down with song, weeping, dancing, begging. Some shouted prophecies in the streets. Others told riddles to tsars. One famous Uradevi, Basil the Blessed, told Ivan the terrible to his face that he had no heart. The Tsar wept. In Russia, these fools were not laughed at. They were feared and sometimes worshipped, because they reminded everyone, God does not always speak clearly. Sometimes he speaks through absurdity. Africa, the trickster and the praise singer cross. West Africa, the role of social critic often fell to the griot, a storyteller, historian, and singer who could use praise or ridicule to shape reputation. But alongside, the griot danced another figure, the trickster in stories. It was often Anansi, the spider, or Esu, the mischievous messenger. These were not jesters in court, but they were fools of another kind, always breaking rules, always teaching lessons, always flipping the world upside down. Through laughter and chaos, they passed on wisdom, and their stories survive to this day. Mesoamerica, the jester before the fallen Aztec society. The jester was both respected and feared. Some were hunchbacked, some dwarfed, seen not as broken but as sacred. Their differences were interpreted as divine. Their performances, ritual, they danced at feasts, performed at sacrifices. And when the Spaniards arrived, they were horrified to find jesters with influence, because in their minds, only kings could command attention. The Aztecs knew better. They knew the fool sees clearly and speaks without fear. North America, sacred clowns of the plains in Lakota and Hopi traditions. You'll find the sacred clown, a figure who walks backward, speaks in riddles, behaves in reverse. They are not jesters, not in the European sense, but they fulfill the same function, to hold up a mirror, to challenge the community, to protect through provocation. During ceremonies, they might pretend to eat greedily or mock sacred rituals, not to insult, but to awaken. They remind the people not to take themselves too seriously, and to remember that humility is holy. The universal fool. So what do we see in all these places? We see the fool as truth-teller, the fool as challenger, the fool as teacher, trickster, priest, and poet. They wear different clothes, speak different languages. Some are laughed at, some are feared, some are both. But all of them, in some way, tell us this: the world is absurd, power is fragile, and only the fool is free. Let that truth settle around you now. Different lands, different voices, but the same soft bells ringing through time. The jester is everywhere, and everywhere he sees. Let your thoughts drift. Let the torchlight flicker and fade. Let the motley blur into feathers, silk, ash, fur, 1,000 costumes, one ancient spirit, and in the distance, a laugh, soft, gentle, echoing from every corner of the world. There were no feasts, no court dances, no cheerful crowds in the gallery, just silence and bells, not the jingle of the jester's cap, but the deep, mournful bells of churches, tolling endlessly as the dead were carried out, one by one. Or 10 by 10, this was the plague. The Black Death, as it came to be known, swept across Europe in the 14th century and beyond. Again and again, cities emptied, fields lay fallow, children cried out for mothers, kings wept alone in sealed chambers, and death moved invisibly, hungrily, through it all. And yet, in that dark, choking moment of history, the jester remained. He didn't vanish. He danced, still, he joked. He sang, because he had to. Gallows humor: when people are afraid, humor becomes survival. The jester didn't laugh because nothing mattered. He laughed because everything did. When death came knocking, people needed release. They needed to hear someone joke about how skinny the bishop had gotten, not from fasting, but from fear. They needed to laugh about coughing nobles, about doctors with beaked masks, about the rats that ruled the streets. They needed to laugh at death, or they would never stop weeping. And so the jester gave them that laughter, even while knowing he might be next. Entertaining in a time of illnessing, some court's jesters were locked away with the royals, part of the sealed inner circle. In others, they were cast out, sent to perform in the squares to lift public spirits, or worse, told to stay silent, as humor was considered offensive in such dire times. But they performed anyway, in back alleys, on doorsteps. One story tells of a jester who wore a plague mask with bells on it and danced for a dying audience. Another tells of fools who dressed up as death itself, mocking it, teasing it, pretending to duel with invisible scythes. These were not just acts of comedy, they were acts of defiance. Defiance against despair. Death beside the throne jesters died too, of course. They were not immune. No one was. But when a king died, it was often the jester who whispered the final joke. Not to be cruel, but to keep something alive. In some royal houses, the jester was allowed to stay by the bedside, to murmur stories, to hum songs, to be, even in those last hours, the one who kept fear at bay. Imagine that, a jester at a deathbed, face pale in candlelight, cap in hand, voice soft, telling the king about the time he slipped on an olive and insulted the ambassador from Spain, and the king, barely breathing, smiles, just a little. That's what the jester could give, even then, especially then. Humor and judgment. Not everyone appreciated the full in plague years. Some thought jesters were cursed, that their laughter brought sickness, that their jokes mocked the suffering of the saints. And so, in some places, jesters were banned, dragged from court, left behind. But the clever ones adapted. They became storytellers, wore black instead of motley, spoke not in jokes, but in parables, and still they remained fools. because even solemnity, delivered by a clown, carries a certain strange power. Laughter in the shadow. Jester during plague years was not a clown as we think of one today. He was an edgewalker, a truth-bearer, a performer with dust on his shoes and fear behind his eyes. But still, he smiled. He juggled skulls and called them wise men. He played a lute with a broken string and said, "It's only a little death." He told children that rats were just cats in disguise, come to dance at night. He made the world feel, for a moment, a little less doomed, and that is not foolishness. It's heroism in disguise. So breathe now, slowly, deeply. Picture the jester in a darkened street, lantern light flickering, the smell of ash and lilac. He is alone, but not afraid. He twirls once, lets his bells ring once more. A song escapes his lips, soft, strange, ancient. And as the wind picks up and carries it away, you understand, he is not laughing at death. He is laughing in spite of it. Let the wind take your worry now. Let the torchlight dim. Let the joke hang gently in the air, long after the plague cart has passed, and let the jester rest. Tomorrow he'll dance again. The halls grew quiet, not all at once, not with a bang, but slowly. Throne rooms went dark, feasts grew smaller, kings lost their power, queens lost their countries, and the role of the jester, once so central, so strange, so vital, began to fade. Or did it? Because while the official title of court jester vanished from palaces and payrolls, the jester never truly disappeared. He just changed clothes. The last court falls by the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Most European courts no longer employed jesters. The rise of absolute monarchy made laughter less welcome. Power wanted polish, prestige, ceremony, not rhymes, not riddles, certainly not public mockery. France, once home to the wild triboulet, now preferred ballet and orchestras. England, after Elizabeth I, leaned into Parliament and Protestant sobriety. Even Russia, with its holy fools, began to silence the eccentric. A few lingered in smaller courts, in Poland, in Bavaria, in Denmark, but they were fading figures, relics, costume curiosities, rather than essential voices. And so officially, the fool was gone, but unofficially, he was just getting started. The rise of the stage clown as courts fell, theatre rose, and the jester, clever as ever, moved with the times in Italy. He became part of Commedia dell'arte, a travelling theatre tradition where masked characters improvised wild, satirical scenes. One of them, Alecchino, wore patchwork clothes and played the fool, hungry, lusty, clever, chaotic. Sound familiar? In England, he became the fool in Shakespeare, not just a clown, but a commentator, Feste, Touchstone, the fool in King Lear. These characters didn't just make jokes, they made meaning. They challenged kings on stage. They turned soliloquies into sermons, wrapped in laughter. Audiences roared. And behind the curtain, the old court jester smiled. He had survived in prose, into the Circassian, the 18th and 19th centuries. The jester evolved again into the clown of the circus. Bright makeup, oversized shoes, pratfalls, slapstick. Some say this was a simplification, that the clown was just a watered-down fool, stripped of his sharpness. But even in the circus, echoes remained. The white-faced clown, regal, elegant, mirrored the king. The august, bumbling, chaotic played the jester, and their dynamic, always the same. one in control, one disrupting, one laughing, one laughed at, one rule maker, one rule breaker. The court had become a tent, the throne a ring, but the dance was still the same. The full on-screen fast forward again. Now the jester sits behind a microphone. He hosts a late-night show. He performs stand-up. He tweets. He memes. He says the things others won't still. Comedians like George Carlin, Joan Rivers, Richard Pryor, Stephen Colbert, Trevor Noah, and so many others, they don't wear bells. But they know the weight of a punchline. They speak to power, mock hypocrisy, make us laugh while making us think. They are, in the truest sense, modern fools, still beloved, still at risk, still walking that old, thin line. The fool endures so. Where is the jester now? He's on stage, behind a mic, in a podcast studio. She's at a poetry slam, cracking jokes between they're in animated shows, in satire news, in viral skits that explode across the internet. The jester is still with us, not as a servant to a crown, but as a servant to truth in disguise, and always in danger. Let your thoughts soften now. The jester stands in a spotlight instead of torchlight, wears sneakers instead of slippers, but the eyes, the grin, the message, still the same. Let the echoes fade, let the applause grow quiet, and know, somewhere out there, the fool still spins. Not forgotten, not gone, just transformed. The motley is gone, the bells are silent. The throne rooms have become museums or rubble. But the fool is still here. Not in velvet slippers or donkey ear hats, but in sneakers, in suits, in sharp heels, on stages, on screens, on live streams. Still joking, still provoking, still dancing dangerously with power. Because the jester didn't die when the kings did. The jester adapted, and the echo of that ancient voice still hums beneath the punchlines we hear today. Stand-up comics. The new court fools walk into a comedy club. Dim lights, a stool, a microphone, and someone steps forward, armed with nothing but a voice. They pace, they rant, they confess, they tease politics, poke fun at the rich, share truths too uncomfortable for polite conversation. Sound familiar, there? Not wearing motley, but they might as well be. George Carlin, with his biting critiques of government and religion. Lenny Bruce, arrested for his jokes. Richard Pryor, turning personal pain into collective catharsis. Hannah Gadsby, weaving comedy into social commentary and trauma. Modern fools, walking the same line. Say what needs to be said, but make them. Laugh, satirists and late-night hosts once. Upon a time, kings had court jesters to speak the truth, wrapped in laughter. Now, we have Jon Stewart, John Oliver, Hazen Minhaj, Samantha Bee, Stephen Colbert, with a fake persona that mirrored real madness. They play characters, crack jokes, but underneath the humor, piercing truths. They reveal hypocrisy, twist news into parody, make us laugh and think. Sometimes harder than we want to. They are jesters with cameras, and yes, they, too, walk the line. Loved one year, cancelled the next, praised for their insight, punished for their audacity. The dance never changed, only the backdrop did. The internet full scroll, your feed, memes, TikToks, skits, roasts. The jester has gone viral. Some wear wigs, some use filters, some lip-sync the powerful back to themselves. Others parody trends, challenge culture, or create chaos with a wink. Humor is faster now, louder, but still there's wit beneath the noise. and the smartest fools online. They know exactly what they're doing. A single punchline can bring down a brand. A viral joke can shift public opinion. A meme can go further than any speech ever will. The platform has changed, but the fool remains. The voice that turns laughter into leverage. Clowns and performers reclaiming the archetypal swear. Artists reclaim the clown, not just as circus performer, but as spiritual presence. Modern clowns like Slava Polunin or Puddle's Pity Party use sadness, silence, and absurdity to create space for reflection. These aren't jokes that make you snort, they're performances that make you weep. Then smile. Performance artists take on the sacred clown's mantle again, mocking capitalism, mourning climate loss, whispering wisdom through absurdity. These are jesters to dot just. Quieter, softer, but no less sharp. Comedy as resistance in oppressed nations, in silenced communities. Comedians are often the first voices to be censored. Why? Because comedy tells the truth faster than speeches ever could. Jesters in exile, satirists in hiding, comedians arrested for skits. They carry the same ancient weight. Make them laugh, but make them listen, and maybe make them change so. Where is the jester now? She's on a Netflix special. He's filming a sketch in his kitchen. They're on stage at an open mic, telling stories that make the room lean in. You might not see the motley, but it's there, in the rhythm of the words, in the courage behind the grin, in the message beneath the joke. The fool never left. They just updated their act. Let your breath deepen now. Let the spotlight fade. Let the jokes soften into echoes. Somewhere, someone is laughing, and someone else is frowning. And the jester, still twirling, still teasing, still telling the truth no one else will say. The court may be gone, but the laughter lives on. And now the candles have burned low. The banquet hall is quiet. The throne sits empty. The bells have stilled. The jester, at last, is tired. He has danced through centuries, through kings and queens, through pandemics and poems, through satire and sorrow. He has worn patchwork and armor. He has sung to emperors and whispered to children. He has made us laugh when we thought we'd forgotten how and now he bows not with grand flourish, not with trumpets or applause, but simply, quietly, with a smile. Because the jester never wanted the spotlight. Not really. He only wanted the truth to be heard, even if it came wrapped in nonsense. So as you rest now, know this: the jester is still there. In every voice that tells truth with tenderness, in every laugh that opens a window to wisdom, in every moment where absurdity helps us breathe again. Maybe you've met the jester in yourself, the part of you that copes through comedy, that uses humor to soften pain, that says what no one else will say and survives. Maybe you've worn motley too, invisible to others, but stitched with resilience. If so, the jester sees you and smiles. So sleep now. Let your thoughts drift gently. Let the court fade away. Let the masks rest on their hooks. Let the jokes echo off into memory. You've journeyed far through laughter, danger, and light. And now it's time to sleep. The jester will keep watch. Good night.